Fourth panel will be, let me get to that page. Carmen Real is a full professor of the Federal University of Santa Catarina as a researcher and CNPq, the National Council of Scientific and Technological Development. She directs the Center for Visual Anthropology Research Group on Urban Anthropology. She received her doctorate from the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. Real is deputy chair of the World Council of the Anthropological Associations and former president of the Brazilian Anthropological Association, the same. Her work focuses on cultural globalization, transnational migration, gender and sport. She's a member of several editorial boards, among which the American Ethnologist, Ethnografia, and Vibrant, a Brazilian publication. She teaches in the graduate program in social anthropology and the interdisciplinary doctorate in the humanities. She has taught at several universities, including the National University of Brasilia, University of República, and the University of Lisbon. She is a visiting scholar at the University of Cádiz in Spain, at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, and at Berkeley University. She has participated in the creation of journals ILHA and Vibrant. She has supervised 21 master's theses and 25 doctoral dissertations. Romeo Guzman is currently an assistant professor in the U.S. in public history at Fresno State University, where he directs the Valley Public History Initiative. He received his PhD in Latin American history at Columbia University in New York. Romeo is currently writing a book that examines how migrant families use formal politics and daily and cultural practices to engage U.S. and Mexican citizenship during the 20th century. His academic writings have appeared in the History of the Family and the Icons of Mexico. His essays on migration, popular culture, and public history have appeared in a range of outlets, including Tropics of Meta, UC Press's Boom magazine. KCT and Letras Libres, Guzman's award-winning public history project, East of East, mapping community narratives in South El Monte and El Monte, and Straight Out of Fresno have received funding from the California Humanities, Los Angeles City of Department of Cultural Affairs, National Performance Network, and Latino Americans. His new research and public history project, Futboleros in Greater Mexico, seeks to follow Mexicans and Mexican-American players as they cross the U.S. border. Our third presenter is Christian Ungrue. He is an anthropologist and postdoctoral researcher at the Section for Sport Science at Aarhus University, Denmark. He receives his PhD from Bayreuth International Graduate School of African Studies in Germany. That was in 2015. His research interests include topics of migration, mobility, national identities, youth work, and sport in West Africa, particularly Ghana. Among his latest publications in mobilities at play, the local embedding of transnational connections in West African football migration, and fans and states at work, a Ghanaian fan trip to the FIFA World Cup 2010 in South Africa. So let's move on to...
Thank you, Stephen, for this introduction. Thank you to Harvard University, to the Simons College, to Stefan Ortega, to Jessica Barnard. Thank you to Mr. Costas for the ride today. And a special thank you to our technical assistant, John. It's the first time that I talk to having in the audience 3 players, François, Christian, and Lilian. C'est une grande responsabilité. Je vais même prendre une photo de vous pour que les personnes sachent que c'est vrai. Bon, I will divide my presentation in 3 parts. I have been researching football for the last 12 years through a multi-sited ethnography who led me to visit many countries, stadiums, training centers, football players' house, and to have contact to more than 60 players, and also with their entourage, family, agents, club directors. I have been using the sport to tackle some social issues: mobility, migration, circulation, changes in gender relations, security and securizations, changes of the religion landscape in Brazil. I'm going to talk about the Brazilian players, but maybe something can be applied to other sports and also to players of other nationalities. Recently, a group of scholars said that the Brazilian player is the only truly global worker in the professional football industry. I agree just partially with the affirmation. Comparing the total population of the neighboring countries, we find out that Argentina has almost 2 times more expatriate footballers and Uruguay 8 times more. Even Greece has a higher number of expatriate football if you take in account the total number of the population. Taking in account the number of host countries, well, even if they are not so many as they say, they are pivotal players in their clubs. And we have 3 Brazilians among the 10 best paid players in the world: Neymar, Oscar, and Hulk. They are the global workers if we take in account the number of countries where they are, and many countries. In addition to the 500 Brazilian expatriate footballers that are celebrities at global clubs in Europe and more recently in China, there is also a numerically significant flow of non-famous players to countries that we are unlike destinations for other Brazilian immigrants, such as Russia, India, Korea, and Morocco. Even though not as influenced in the world finance-scape as in the media-scape, such immigration has somehow significant consequence for clubs' finances. Players' transfers has become a vital source of financial support, without which clubs would not be able to maintain the current high salaries paid to their other professionals. The migration of Brazilian players is not a recent phenomenon. The first of such wave took place in the 30s, after the World Cup in Uruguay. The main destination was Italy, homeland of the ancestors of many of the immigration players. Well, we have to know that at that time, São Paulo had more Italians than Veneza, for instance. We observed many changes from the immigration of players like Pacotti, who played in Portugal in the 60s, to Ricardo Oliveira, who I met in Spain. Ricardo will be used as my main example of the new wave of Brazilian expatriate players. When I spoke to him in Sevilla, well, here is Pacotti, his house. He lived in a very small apartment. Here is the house of Ricardo Oliveira. Ricardo was playing in Sevilla when I met him. He had already played for the Brazilian national team and was leading scorer in the Spanish league, and he played in many other countries. Ricardo met his wife, Deborah Oliveira, at an evangelical church when she was 14 years old. He lived with his wife, who was 17 when I met them, and his 9-month son, Anthony Richard, in a 2-story house in Simon Verde, a luxury condominium in the city. Ricardo was very, very poor during his childhood. He used to beg in the street. But this is not the case of the other Brazilian expatriate football players. The majority of them come from subaltern classes, rural workers, workers in the car industry, some of them middle lower classes, the son of a police detective, a nurse, and only one was a middle class, a son of a doctor. In this respect, they are not so different from other Brazilian immigrants. Ricardo it is an exception. Curiously, I have found that the large majority among them are the youngest in their families, caçulas. Many of Many had older brothers who also wished to play football, but they were pulled out of this project in order to help to support the family. Football player career is a family project, which, and they need to have an economic surplus as a precondition for liberating one member of the family from paid work. There is a tendency for the wives to have higher schooling. A story that Michael told me, it's almost a myth. When I was born, my dad took our umbilical cords to the Novo Hamburgo field, right to the middle of it, and buried them there. He looked up to the sky and said, "God's will shall be done. One of them will have to succeed." And that turned out to be me. Even though sometimes framed as part of something divine design, entry in the football system takes place in different avenues. Their milestone break occurred while still in Brazil, when they first left home, in the case of some players during their adolescence. This event ushers in their circulation the beginning of their rodar, where the first frontier overcome is that of the family and the neighborhood circles. Virtually all interviews used the first significant income they got to buy a house for their mother, as did Ricardo Oliveira and Gomes. In making a dream come true, they reciprocate some of what they claim to have received. It resonates less with the idea of ostentatious consumption, but with security and construction of social networks. Because of a moral code in which honor has a central place, the house is said to go to the mother and not to the father. It should not endanger the honor of a man. They do live in spacious houses in noble neighborhoods, usually those concentrating a large number of football players, but some, like in Morocco, in rather small apartments. I did not notice any extravagance in their interior decor. The only luxury consumption repeatedly noted among them were brand new luxury cars, which are sometimes provided by the club, diamond earrings, and the ubiquitous Louis Vuitton and Burberry trousse of toilette. Let me go on. Living in a bubble. Frontier are a special space. They are slippery, dangerous, controlled, repressed, hybrid, and potentially bloody thresholds. The thousands of Brazilians who now live as undocumented workers abroad are aware of this. This is not the case of football players whose movement across frontiers I analyze here. They cross borders in a bubble composed of homogenized, guarded, protected space of limited access that can be designed as known places. Their home place are marked by effort to establish a Brazilianness. For instance, a modality of consumption very emphasized is Brazilian food. They eat Brazilian food at home or in restaurants serving food similar to the Brazilian diet in Spain, France, and in the Netherlands, as well as in China, Korea, or Japan. The restaurants they go to almost every day are either Brazilian or serving Brazilian food, which is similar to Brazil. Each time they visit the country, many products are brought back in their luggage, and many others are obtained through importers or brought by guests, relatives, and friends. They buying sites like Finally Brazil, that has a store in Amsterdam, or in trucks like the one I visited in Tokyo when I met Hook. The set of commodities they consume thus continually reassert their national identities in a sort of banal nationalism, an invisible but always present nationalism. So their quotidian practice repeatedly and almost unconsciously reaffirm their Brazilianness, bringing them together while demarking frontier vis-à-vis the local others. The place seems to count little for players. Even though they might purchase real estate and have kids there, they live with a permanent possibility of switching to another club in another city or country. What seems like a cosmopolitan consumption connects them elsewhere, cable TV, internet, is in fact an instrument of approximation with Brazil. It keeps them integrated with their original national community. Obtaining citizenship of the host country by no means implies gaining nationalist sentiments toward it. To acquire legal citizenship is a strategic move which does not mean incorporate some of other national belonging. I said that yesterday. Citizenship is a strategic citizen, as proposed by Saskia Sassi. Brazilianness remains the sole identity of ethnic belonging. The players contacted by my research, for instance, would not speak of becoming citizen, but of being able to get a community passport, a European passport, a formula itself legally impossible. But this statement encapsulates the motivations behind nationalization. First, to circulate freely between the member countries of the European Union. Second, to make room for another Brazilian in the club. Thus, paradoxically, nationalization into a European country could favor the evasion rather than permanence, which is a stark contrast to other modalities of international immigration. Players who choose other national teams express the same national belong to the original country. It's a professional choice rather than a subjective one. Furthermore, to travel across borders does not necessarily mean that players get to know the country they visit. Routine in these trips is pre-designed by the club and highly controlled. There is not much time left. When I asked Nilsson whether he knew many countries, his ironic answer was, "We know the hotels and the airports very well." Brazil is seen as a pleasant and safe haven where players go when they are sick or need some other kind of medical treatment. The Brazilian healthcare system is unanimously regarded by players as more efficient. More than technology, the advantage pointed out by players is the close attention bestowed on them by the health professionals. This is a positive narrative of what a Spanish doctor told me. They are spoiled. The same holds true for their wives, who may travel to Brazil in order to take their children to pediatric visits or spend considerable time periods there during their pregnancies. When a friend is brought along, the club encourages closer contact among Brazilians by hiring a group of players when a friend is not brought along. This has indeed been a characteristic of Brazilian players' successful migration abroad, the constitution of networks of mates within a club. It's possible that in the future, this becomes a profession. Aris, for instance, who played in AZ, their manager have hired a journalist, Marcio, who is with him in all time as an interpreter, driver, secretary, and even live in his house. This practice makes mixes providing a service with surveillance and friendship, therefore blurring the boundaries between work and personal life. It was also the case of Falcão with Pato, Ronaldo with César, and today Neymar with Cebola and the other toys. Sacrifice. It's not a good picture, but I love it because it was in this training center of PSV, and it showed the Brazilians freezing, and they couldn't cope with the weather. They returned to Brazil, and after they regretted that. Live abroad, for them, as they told me, it is a sacrifice. They talk about the weather, but not the food and the solitude. They live in voluntary exile with all the pain that the word encapsulates. Many of them told me about their learning experience to get to know another culture as a personal gain, but the emphasis of their discourse is on saudade and sacrifice. Saudade is longing. The direct dialogue with God or Jesus was seen as a strategic in handling the saudades that shortened the career abroad of so many of them. Religion's practice. Based on news report, I expected to find bad boys when I initiate my contacts with Brazilian players who had emigrated abroad. Not that I didn't find them, but it was the opposite that surprised me. There are many players, Brazilian players, evangelicals and Catholicos. The Bible is read daily. The Bible is said the word is often used as synonym of the Bible. Now, some get together to read it at each other's homes, along with their families, or in the training facilities. The religious scape in Brazil has dramatically changed in recent years. Christianity used to be synonymous with Catholicism in the country, but no longer is, since there has been a meteoric rise of evangelical denominations, and notably of neo-Pentecostal churches. Almost 1 in every 4 Brazilians now identifies themselves as evangelical, most of them neo-Pentecostal. Let's go back to Ricardo Oliveira. Ricardo repeatedly told me how important faith was to his life. His entrance in the church was seen as a watershed marked by a commitment to God. Ricardo, like other players, described his life as being divided by a before in the kingdom of evil and an after when they entered the kingdom of God. In the before, these players messed up, drank, took drugs, not the case of Ricardo, went out with lots of women. They never told me that because I'm a woman, but I could guess by the way they are not saying. And sometimes they could be violent at home. But after they joined faith, their life has changed. Faith, it's an abstract concept, but is expressed by the players in specific forms, word, gesture, and corporal marks. Tattoos, along with other forms as chains and crucifix, are seen as works that reaffirm faith. Because, as expressed in a belief commonly held among many religions, faith without works are dead. The player's body becomes a billboard of their Christianity, serving to propagate faith in a banal religiosity. Tattoos, corporal marks, display material proof of their faith as a pledge of loyalty, a daily reminder, a way to avoid the breaking of the bond that would bring punishment and disgrace. They also construct a narrative of a different subjectivity, including a man who is guided by Christian ethical and moral principles. Gestures. Gestures are also ways of showing faith. There are a variety of
Carmen?
countless small rituals that the athletes conduct before, during, and after each game. The most recurrent being the raising of the hands to the sky in celebration of a goal. Sometimes this gesture is made while kneeling.
3 more minutes? Is that good?
Well, so 3 more minutes. I have to hush. Words. Sometimes they inscribe the words, the Bible, in their body. Sometimes they send posts by internet. Neymar, always before a game, they send a post saying, God protect us. But what about Ricardo Oliveira? Ricardo has become a pastor, as many other players. And
buscando neste mundo, no samba, pouco de paz e de alegria.
He opened a church in the Emirates. He is with his wife, Deborah, and this is their church in an Arabic country. He went to the Arabic country because he saw, I don't need sound, because he had a dream that he had to go there. He also gave talks about Jesus before the games, and even, well, plays. Now we can have a little song. Okay. Thank you, Jesus, is what they are saying. He's not the only one. Here we can see Kaká when he was anointed bishop also in his church. When he was negotiated to Real Madrid, he gave a lot of money to this church. Kaká is one of the players that come from middle class and did not suffer with racism. Other players suffer with racism, and this was also part of the sacrifice. I'm just FIFA. Okay, I'm just finishing with two things. They give back what they to their families. This is a silver plate in Gomes' house, thanking all the brothers, but also to the communities. They have institutes. I'm not going to talk about that, but Mike, Richard, and Dara already did. This is an institute of Cafu, other of Neymar, Rai, and Leonardo. And the last thing I want to say is that even if they live in a bubble, they get to know other players and they learn about the other players. This is a picture of the Bom Senso movement that they founded in Brazil. It's a political movement. They are with our president-elected Dilma Rousseff, who suffered a coup d'etat, a parliamentary coup d'etat. And this would be not possible if they had not gained this kind of experience abroad. Brazil, it's not very political in football. I let this last picture, but I'm not going to say anything, except that I took it in a very small town in Tunisia, in a cafe. This is the Alcoran, and this is, well, you know who are. Thank you very much for your attention.
I get it. Where's this? Okay. I feel like I'm supposed to, do the persinar and touch the grass and stretch, right? I feel like I'm supposed to do both of those things at once right now. I'm a historian of Mexican migration, particularly in the early mid-20th century, and I generally focus on okay. Don't save. Got it. Don't save. Okay. And then, so this is a new project for me. I've played soccer. I'm obviously not very good, which is why I'm here talking about it instead of playing it. So I'm really, really excited to be here to sort of write about something that I've been intimately involved with, and particularly here in this very beautiful place. And like everyone else, I wanted to sort of thank Olympiacos, Harvard, and Simmons College, not just for all the beautiful setups and the dinners and all this amazing stuff, but also for really bringing together this really eclectic and unique group of people, right? We have scholars, we have activists, we have scholar activists, and we have world-class players, right? And those things never come together. So it's a really interesting way to think about how we sort of continue to build as academics, but also as people that are invested in a game that obviously bleeds out of our scholarship. So I want to begin with a quote, but before that I have to sort of give some context. So in 2004, the Mexican club team Chivas establishes a sister team in the US called Chivas USA, right? And as part of their effort to recruit and foster a community of Mexican supporters in the US, they create these academies, these youth academies. And they particularly target Mexican Americans, the children of Mexican migrants. And their rhetoric to parents as well as children was that if they came up through the youth ranks, they could both play for Chivas USA in the US, as well as Chivas in Mexico and Guadalajara, right? So Alexi Lalas, who you all know because of the hair and because he was a big-time US national team player, took issue with Chivas' strategy, and I'll quote him. "If you were a young boy playing soccer in Southern California and you don't have a Mexican or Hispanic heritage, do you have an equal opportunity to play for both your teams in Los Angeles? And right now the answer is no, and I don't know if this is a message the league wants to send." So despite Lala's history and time in the US, his sort of quote and his comments reflected this deep disconnect with soccer, and particularly with the Mexican American community. And I sort of open with Lalas, not because I'm going to talk about Chivas or Lalas himself, but as a sort of challenge, right? I hope that by the end of the talk, it'll be clear why his quotes sort of not only reveal a disconnect with soccer on the ground, but also a sort of ignorance of the history of soccer, particularly the place of Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans in both the US and Mexican nation. So I'll get started. "Below a crisp blue sky lies an open field of green. Its perfectly trimmed Bermuda grass is a uniform hue, devoid of light greens and browns. This bed is framed by two sets of rounded goalposts with white nets that cut through space with the precision of a spider's web. Every element of this spatial configuration is deliberate, conducive to its purpose of playing soccer in as perfect form as possible. Under the direction of Juan Sanchez, the Mount San Antonio Community College soccer team has come pretty close to perfection. The San Gabriel Valley-based college squad is one of the best in the state, winning the state championship 5 times and national championship twice. Each year, Juan Sanchez meticulously selects local players, creates a formation and game plan for the season, and Juan shares one thing in common with his players, is that they're all children of Mexican migrants, and they're also all first-generation college students. Indeed, Juan's own journey reveals the intimate relationship between the development of soccer in Mexico, the slow growth of the sport in the US, and the place of both Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans in these two countries. So what I try to do is I try to sort of follow this migrant family across both borders, from Mexico to the US and back, as a way to sort of outline a history of soccer and a history of sort of the mutual relationship these two countries share. So our story will sort of start with Don Aurelio Sanchez. Aurelio was born in 1944. He's born in La Experiencia, a small town in Guadalajara. We'll sort of look at one of the first clubs that he ends up playing for, Club Imperio. We'll follow Don Aurelio across the border, and then finally we'll talk about Juan Sanchez, his time in the US, his time in what people refer to as the Sunday Leagues, and we'll sort of end by looking at Juan's sort of professional career in both Mexico and the US. So the family, I think, provides a particularly interesting vantage point for us, right? One is that the family allows us to situate transnational football and football players in transnational place across multiple generations and in youth, adult, amateur, and professional leagues. I won't get into the scholarship too much, but one of the challenges with the scholarship, one of the problems is that we tend to define transnational space within a very limited sort of terrain, right? A lot of the scholarship on Mexican migrants looks at transnationalism within DC, Chicago, or California, sort of pick your ethnographic location, right? So the family provides a particularly unique way to situate these players in actual transnational spaces, right? Both in the home country and the receiving country. And the other sort of reason why I sort of picked the family is that this particular family sort of is situated within a couple really key historical moments. One is the rise of soccer as Mexico's pastime in the 1960s and 70s, the growth of soccer in the US in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and perhaps as more importantly, the migration of Mexicans during the 60s and 70s and their subsequent legalization in 1986 with IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act. So I won't go too long into the history, but as all of you know, soccer arrives to Mexico through European migrants in the late 19th, early 20th century. After the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and 1917, the government and sort of corporations start promoting sport, and particularly soccer, as a way to discipline workers. And one of the very first club teams in Guadalajara and in Mexico is Club Imperio. So I'll sort of go ahead and read and talk a little bit. On a Sunday evening in June of 1918, a group of workers from the textile factory, Compañía Industrial de Guadalajara, gathered on a small vacant plot of land to try their luck with a new game known as football. Rather than a level playing field for the ball to roll, these new futboleros had to contend with small mounds of land. The goalies were charged with guarding and protecting a simple line on the ground. The conditions of the field matched the workers' lack of skill and knowledge of the game. To move the ball up the field and towards the opposing goal, players hit those in their path. Players were so creative in hitting their opponents that a new vocabulary emerged to describe these moves. It was from these humble origins in 1918 that Club Imperio gave birth to some of Guadalajara's first and finest professional soccer players, and one of Jalisco's most dominant amateur soccer teams. So I'll talk a little bit about how it is that the club grows, but one of the really important things is that the factory owners invest a lot of money. They purchase uniforms and balls. In the 1930s, they actually create a soccer field, as well as showers and dressing rooms. And they use their position as a company in very strategic ways. At some point, they actually allow players to leave work early on Tuesday and Friday to practice, but they also use the company as a strategic tool to attract new players. So they would often sort of find an opponent, a player that they liked, and they would offer him a job in the factory under the condition that he would also play on the field. Of course, regardless of the community, the state or government or sort of factory investment into soccer, it could not have been possible without the support of community members. And while they didn't have the same financial resources as factories, community members are vital to this process. A lot of former players become coaches, particularly in the youth leagues. A lot of former players, when they got hurt, became referees, which was part of a requirement for the league. And of course, this is a very gendered practice, right? A lot of the women were spectators, and indeed, they would dress up in white and blue, the official colors of the team, as sort of part of their participation. And one of the ways in which we can sort of track and think about the growth or the professionalization of Club Imperio is that they start creating positions within the squad, right? So componedor comes from the word componer, which means to fix, right? And because they don't quite have a name for this doctor on the team, they call him the componedor, right? Or the fixer. We also start to see ball boys whose only job is to take care of the balls, to sew them, to care for them, to pick up the equipment. And perhaps one of the most important ways in which we can think about the professionalization or the growth of Club Imperio is that by the mid-1930s, they're able to field about 6 different teams, which includes youth teams. And slowly over time, the game and the team start embedding themselves in the local community. And one of the most important ways we can think about this is the celebration of National Independence Day, as well as Cinco de Mayo, 2 huge national celebrations that often sort of take on 1, 2, 3 days. So this one in here is from 1935, and it was a 2-day celebration for national independence. And on the first day, they had this big stage where Mexicans dressed up from different nations. So we had Mexicans dressing up in the stereotypical charro, the Mexican cowboy. We had Mexicans dressing up as English and Frenchmen. And the following day after the play, there was this big procession where all of the people in the play were in their costume. There was a band, there was a community, and then there was the football players themselves. And they all sort of walked to the field, and at the field itself, they all sort of watched the game, right? So we see the game slowly embed itself in sort of the quotidian calendar, but also within the sort of rhythm and sort of national celebrations of, of the community. And of course, if we're talking about spaces, we can also think about the ways in which soccer embeds itself in these very local quotidian spaces. I don't know if you guys can make this out, but the individual who's almost looking straight at us, he's getting a haircut. So this is a barbershop. So the barbershop and the pulqueria, which is a drink in Mexico, become places where community members and fans would talk about soccer, right? And this is in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. So by the 1940s, the community had embedded itself, Club Imperio had embedded itself within the community. And by 1944, the year of Aurelio Sanchez's birth, La Experiencia and football were deeply intertwined and the town's geography clearly marked. Nestled a few miles from cosmopolitan Guadalajara, La Experiencia was populated by just a few thousand people, and one single street connected the town's entrance and exit. Streets ran north and south and east and west, both above and below La Experiencia's main corridor, and resembled a neatly organized grid. Just outside the city's gates, residents used their hands to till and organize the land and to turn cotton into textile. Both the factory owners and agriculturalists found proximity to the river and open space both favorable and productive. Like many other residents, the Sanchez family lived within the town, but housed their cows and produce just outside the city's gates. And it was during this movement between two spaces that a young 5-year-old Aurelio Sanchez envisioned his future, and I quote, "Outside La Experiencia's gate was the river and the football field. Around the field there were properties, and on one side of the field my father had a home where we housed and milked cows. When he cut down the maize field, he took the stalk and made a really tall stack, like a pyramid. I would climb to the top of the pyramid, and from the top of it, watch Club Imperio's games for free. From the top of the pyramid stalk, I saw Imperio's first division team play unos partidazos." There's no translation for partidazos, sorry. "And as I sat there, I said to myself, one day I'm going to play there," end quote. And La Experiencia, football was not confined to the chalk lines on the dirt pitch, and the town's children were particularly adept at using their environment to imagine and create temporary fields. The children gathered cotton that floated from the textile factory onto the llano and formed it into a sphere. They then placed 2 to 3 rocks in the center of the cotton and wrapped it all with a string. After a full day of being kicked around, the ball lost its shape, but not its utility. To greet the night, young futboleros drenched the rock cotton string ball with petroleum and lit it on fire. Aurelio loved to play and watch soccer, but he was not comfortable with the ball at his feet. And I quote, "I wanted to pass the ball, but I couldn't do it. My feet would get stuck." A casual encounter forever changed Aurelio's relationship with the ball. A 5-year-old Aurelio was walking down La Experiencia's cobbled streets, playing with the ball when an older man and resident of the neighborhood gestured to him. As soon as the ball hit the man's foot, he pushed it forward and yelled, "Here it comes," and took a shot at Aurelio and the imaginary goal, a common pastime for both urban and suburban players. Ignoring the cobbled streets and its unforgiving hardness, a young Aurelio dove and stopped the shot. The man took another shot, and again Aurelio dove. After this brief exchange, the man was convinced that Aurelio's place was between the goal. "You're a goalie," he told Aurelio, and then proceeded to take him to the nearby field for a pickup game to test his theory. Now, of course, the man was right, and Aurelio goes on to play for Club Imperio. They have a couple really good seasons in the early 60s. By this time, Mexico's professional league is already formed, but Club Imperio is so competitive they actually have sort of friendlies against some of the big teams. Eventually, Aurelio gets selected for Jalisco, which is Selección Jalisco, which is an amateur team in Jalisco that sort of picks the best players from the state, and they play against other states. He eventually gets picked up by La Piedad, which is a second division team in another state, and eventually he makes it to Atlas, which is one of the big teams in Guadalajara. He plays for Atlas for 1 season, and he's let go. But what's interesting about the way in which he is let go is They give him his credencial, they give him his salary, and in addition to that, they gave him this really important paper, a visa. And the story is that Atlas was going to travel to San Francisco, and they were planning on taking him, but he ended up getting cut. So as they're sort of letting him go, in a gesture of solidarity, they ask him, hey, do you want this visa? It's good for 2 years. So Aurelio takes the visa, sticks it in his pocket, and sort of leaves it alone for a couple years. While he's at Atlas, Aurelio actually gets married. He has a child. And by 1970, things aren't going well for him, so he decides to migrate. And what's interesting about his migration experience, perhaps like the Brazilians, is that his local network of Club Imperio and Atlas teammates tell him to go to Chicago. Because in Chicago, they have connections, they have amateur teams, and he can get paid to play there. But like the Brazilians, he's not down with the cold, so he goes to LA instead. And in LA, he quickly finds a team. He gets paid to play on Sunday leagues. And through playing and through getting paid on Sunday leagues, he eventually gets a job, right? So I have 5 minutes, is that? Yeah, okay, so I'll go ahead and skip some parts of this. So the family sort of lives in a garage. There's no AC, there's no bathroom. It's very sort of stereotypical sort of migrant upbringing, right? Juan Sanchez plays in Sunday leagues, which are essentially migrant leagues. The fields have grass in some areas, they don't have grass in other places. Sometimes there's a net, sometimes there's not a net. There's usually one ref who has the awkward and challenging task of marking offsides from 50 yards behind the ball. But slowly, as he gets better, he gets picked up by one of the club teams. In the 70s and 80s, the US sort of develops these sort of very competitive club teams that are based in affluent white neighborhoods. And usually they're exclusionary because you have to pay to play, right? So Juan, because of his skill, he gets picked up. He's playing for one of these club teams. And because of that, his sort of horizons open up, and he starts thinking about going to college. So he actually wants to go to San Diego State, but he goes to visit Cal State with one of his friends. And when he gets there, he finds out that Leonardo Cuellar is one of the coaches there, right? So Juan is sort of starstruck. Leonardo Cuellar, without seeing the young man play, gives him a scholarship, and he eventually plays for Cal State LA. Now, Cuellar's story is really interesting in the sense that he ends up migrating to the NASL, which is from 65 to 85. And Americans are so bad at this time at playing soccer that most of these teams are composed by foreign. It's true, it's in the literature. that most of these teams are composed by foreign players. So the San Diego Stalkers are composed by both. They have Hugo Sanchez and they have Leonardo Cuellar. After Cuellar retires from there, he becomes a coach, and then he eventually becomes a coach at Cal State LA. Now, what's particularly interesting about Juan's narrative is that when Juan arrives to play for Leonardo Cuellar after his season, Cuellar sends him to Mexico to play for Pumas. He's playing for Pumas. He's playing on the team that has Jorge Campos and a couple other national team players. He gets cut after 6 months. He comes back to the US. He plays in indoor. He plays in indoor for 3 seasons. All 3 seasons that the league exists. The league folds. He gets cut. And then finally he goes back to Tijuana, right, to play for a second division team. He's playing for the second division team. They actually make the playoffs, but in a sort of story all too common to Mexico, the administrators hadn't paid their fees, so the team doesn't get to go into the playoffs, right? And to add insult to injury, Juan decided to stop playing for them, but because he had a contract, they don't let him try out for MLS, right? So Juan, in many ways, a Mexican-American who sort of goes to Mexico, fails in his own language, right? And then he sort of comes back kind of like a migrant, right? Like kind of like a migrant who had failed, empty-handed, disheartened, and disillusioned. And he sort of decides to abandon soccer. Let me jump to one of these pictures. He decides to abandon soccer, and then someone invites him to play, and he slowly starts playing again. And then he eventually becomes a coach, and he becomes a coach at Mount San Antonio Community College, which is a community college based in Southern California. And unlike a four-year university, you don't need a particular GPA, right? So through sort of his own trajectory, Juan has sort of thought about what this space means, and most of his teams are composed of first-generation migrants that go on to go play for four-year colleges, but also go on to succeed off the field. And as all of you know, I think I have the honor of having the longest flight. So I'll end with that. I was flying over here, and I was reading Laurent Du Bois' Soccer Empire. And I was reading it, I sort of read Lillian Thurham's words, which according to Du Bois, you can tell me if he's wrong. He says that Thurham's football journey represents a story of limits rather than opportunities. So he's quoting you as saying that, your trajectory speaks to the limits of soccer, right? Not necessarily its possibilities. And I think Juan's story sort of fits that way and fits that mold in some ways, that his trajectory in the US represents the limits of US soccer in the 80s and 90s, right? But yet his own sort of new labor as a coach perhaps represents its possibilities. So I'll end there.
Our next speaker will be Christian Angrue.
Okay, so also from my side, cheers to everyone who's been involved in organizing and running this great event. Greetings also from Stine Ejergaard, who co-authored this paper. She couldn't come today. She has to finish a book. And while our focus is on males football today, if you're interested in female perspectives of African football migration, then I would highly recommend Stine's work. So, football immobility's West African perspectives. My first encounter with football in its entanglement with spatial and social immobilities in West Africa was back in 1998. And at that time, I was working for a street youth project in southern Ghana. And football training was at that time the ideal means to attract marginalized young people to participate in other activities such as education. And the boys did very well, and thus we decided to register them as a team for the local third division, which is the entry tier for organized male football in the country. And in this process, we needed to produce football identity cards for everyone. And due to the lack of birth certificates for most of them, I had to ask everyone to fill in forms and to state his birthday on that card. And I knew that almost all of the boys were my age, 18, 19 years old at that time. And however, when I collected the cards back, they all stated an age of 14 or 15 years. And then, quite astonished, I confronted them with their sudden age loss and said something like, "Come on, boys, what's that about? Why do you want to be small boys on paper?" And then everyone was smiling at me, and it took a while till one of the players, called Daniel, said to me, "Well, everyone is doing this. If we do well, and then we can still play for the junior national team and get exposure, and then we can go to Europe to play there." And then I said something like, "Guys, we register for the lowest league, and who is going to spot you here anyway?" And apparently I was still quite unaware of how things work in Ghana, and I insisted on stating the correct ages in the documents. And the boys, as you can imagine, were not happy about it. However, they did quite well in the league, although not too well as you could expect from 18, 19-year-olds competing with 15-year-olds. So hence, it didn't come as a surprise that no one of our boys got spotted and made a career in football afterwards. So why am I sharing this story? My topic today is how football and social immobility are connected for young men in West Africa. And above all, this entanglement is visible in relation to transnational migration, particularly to Europe. And among young men, becoming somebody in life by marriage and social reproduction and through educational or economic success is a crucial cultural norm. However, those pathways are increasingly blocked for the contemporary young generation, also because economic growth in the region has not led to a sufficient supply of jobs. On the other hand, migration has been a means to bypass traditional roads to social mobility for generations, be it internally to find employment in cities or industrial centers, or internationally and find greener pastures abroad. And nowadays, football has become one of those migration strategies, and that's ever since Ghana's triumph at the 1991 FIFA Under-17 World Cup and the liberalization of foreign player restrictions in European football in the course of the Bosman ruling in 1995. And since then, European clubs in men's football have started to recruit African players in numbers, and the outstanding examples of players like Drogba, Eto'o, or Essien have nurtured then the imaginaries of many boys and young men in West Africa to follow in their footsteps. And from media reports and almost daily broadcasting of European matches there, we know about these stories of success. For young men in West Africa, though, it is not just football what counts, but apparently the migrant footballer's lifestyle that is associated with fast cars, with big houses, and model girlfriends. And probably you can see a bit here, a poster which you can buy on Ghanaian streets of Accra. This is the 2005 squad of Ghana's national team. And you can see photos of players, and then more importantly, their houses in Ghana and their cars. And also, if they have beautiful kids and wives, then also those pictures. And that's the 2015 edition, though, and some clubs and girlfriend affiliation may have changed, so sorry for that old picture. So, on the other hand, we have already heard from Derek yesterday and from boys in academies and their struggle to achieve likewise as these players. And we have probably all read about a phenomenon labeled as football trafficking, meaning dubious agents who trick and exploit talents to go to Europe, a journey which then seldom materializes. And while these examples may feed our knowledge about African football migration to a great degree, probably then little is known about the great majority of players in West Africa, which is their everyday or ordinary players. And this batch of players include those playing outside their academies, like the boys of the team I coached back in 1998, yet also those who have made it as professional footballers to Europe, but do not really fit the picture of role models like Drogba, like Eto'o or Essien, and rather struggle to get by, and that particularly after career ending. So Sin and I, we argue that a focus on those rather ordinary, aspiring and former football migrants provide deeper insights, or may provide deeper insights into local understandings of football migration and its entanglement with social mobilities and immobilities. Therefore, I will focus on those two examples of players from before and after their career and their struggle with achieving social mobility through football, and I will continue chronologically with the former. So, I had almost forgotten about the incident that I outlined in the beginning of my former players' dream of becoming professional footballers in Europe when I returned to Ghana in early 2010. And this time, though, I indeed came to conduct fieldwork on football migration. And however, initially, I wanted to focus on local professionals or academy players, assuming that they were the right targets for such an inquiry. And before I embarked on the research, I paid visits to some of my old friends, many of them from outside football. And when they asked me whether I will work again with street use as usually, I began to talk about my new research topic on football. And then particularly the guys at my age, they were astonished. And I got reactions like, "Oh, Christian, you know I'm a very good footballer," or "Christian, I'm sure you can get me a club in Germany." And these were usual statements I heard every time I met one of them, assuming that I could serve as kind of a football agent and get them a club in Europe. And it seems that within the few years since my last visit, everyone had become a talented footballer. Among some of them who never showed any interest into the game or hardly ever kicked the ball. For them, then football was just a random and by no means realistic opportunity to make it to Europe. Just their latest hype in the media and in conversations among their peers. Well, but on the other hand, other friends I met were, as I then remembered, quite skillful players indeed, still without any chance of getting a contract abroad. And Daniel, now 30 years old, was one of them. And in 2010, he was playing for a second division club in southern Ghana and looking for any kind of opportunity to move out, still at his age. And he told me, "When you play football in Ghana, you are a beggar. And he referred to a friend who plays for a third division club in South Africa, where he receives free food and accommodation in addition to a daily allowance of $4. And Daniel said, look, he plays third division and he gets money. Here in Ghana, even if you play Premier League, the clubs don't pay you. So in one day, Daniel and I were strolling through his neighborhood in the outskirts of Accra, when I saw an advert posted at fences and shops. That advert, I hope it's somehow clear visible. Black capital letters on a simple white paper stated that footballers of all ages from under 15 years onwards were wanted for professional contracts abroad, followed by a phone number to call in case of interest. If you now busy write that phone number down because you think you're a great footballer, that line has been cut. Sorry for that. So asking Daniel whether he has seen something like that before, he said, it's a fraud. When you call the number, they invite you for a trial tournament. I did this 3 times already, thanks. I even went to Kumasi, which is a town 200 km north west of Accra. And each time I had to pay 15 to 30 cedis, which were 10 to 12 euros at that time, to register. So he had to pay money to take part in that tournament. And he said, they promised to take the good ones to Ajax Amsterdam or Bayer Leverkusen. So you go to the tournament, play a match, and then the organizers say, we have your number, we'll contact you. They say they don't want to choose the best players in front of the others to make them jealous, so they should all go home and wait for the call. But Daniel then said, no call. And when calling them, they either said it's all cancelled, or they have cut their line, as in this case. And Daniel's descriptions reflect usual experience among ordinary young footballers in Ghana, aiming for an opportunity to make it abroad. And to give you an idea of the scope, it's Club Food Solidaire, a human rights organization working particularly in football migration. They state that each year about 15,000 African youth actively look for an opportunity to migrate through football. We should always be careful with numbers, but that's what they state. And in addition, I hope Derek could verify this. I got this from the literature. The Right to Dream Academy recently screened 18,000 boys for 15 available places at their premises. So hence, it's only a very low percentage that gets the chance to make it, and thus football immobility is a widespread phenomenon in Ghana and other African settings. And that said, even if a young man makes it abroad as a professional footballer, that does not mean that his future is carefree and he lives a life as one of the African football celebrities. Rather, on the contrary, playing professional football in Europe often implies precarious livelihoods and social immobilities, particularly when approaching the end of one's career. And that would lead me now to the second example. So entering one's professional career's afterlife is a challenging turning point in the lives of many professional athletes. Many African players we talked to were rarely prepared for their post-career trajectories and were facing financial difficulties and a declining social status. And apparently, acquired social mobility during one's career is difficult to maintain afterwards. And why is that so? According to a study of the International Players Association, FIFPro, and contrary to the widespread West African image of footballers' wealth and excessive lifestyles, many professional players live on minimum salaries and face financial challenges during their careers. And according to Raffaele Poli, the sports migration scholar, this counts in particular for African players in Europe. Thus, many lack the possibility of accumulating sufficient financial means in order to secure a smoother transition into post-careers and to bridge times of unemployment and/or job seeking. And this is visible in Ibrahim's case. Ibrahim came to Denmark as an 18-year-old promising young talent from Ghana, signed by an upcoming Danish club. Despite his talent, he never had a breakthrough as a player. And during his career, he suffered from a recurrent sickness and a severe injury. Most of his contracts were not renewed, and he had to change clubs frequently, spending most of his careers in the lower tier divisions of the country, where salaries were very scarce. Following another knee injury and the termination of his contract, he was unable to find a new club. But after 8 years in the country, he was then forced to start thinking about his life after football. Though he was in his mid-20s and he did not want to give up the dream of professional football, he could not afford to only train and to recover and look for a new club. Alternatives were rare, however, and he said, "I just wanted to work, I just wanted to earn money, but I didn't have any education, so how can you survive it?" Nevertheless, since he was entitled to social benefits, municipal authorities demanded further qualification and sponsored him a job training to become an assistant nurse. And he did that course, and he graduated after 14 months and now works as a full-time ancillary nurse in the elderly care sector, which is a job in which salaries are also rather low and which comes with particular challenges for him due to his incurred injuries. Though low salaries form only part of the transitional difficulties. Moreover, the subordinate role of education and job training during professional careers leaves retiring athletes widely unqualified for jobs outside sport. On the one hand, African players often lack required qualification or language skills for entering such relevant programs in European countries. On the other hand, clubs in European football usually do not support education or job trainings for African players, and that's often for a simple reason, because making use of the benefit of African labor at a comparatively low cost, investing in and promoting career alternatives for the African players would contradict their profit-driven approach. And in the absence of adequate occupational alternatives, many former players attempt to remain in the football business then, for example, as coaches or soccer agents. But this business has very limited and competitive employment opportunities only. And again, the players lack sufficient qualification for this and find it hard to compete in the business. And it is only often until actually reaching the time of career endings when players realize the difficulties and challenges that go along with further occupational trajectories. So looking at both examples of Daniel and Ibrahim, the before and after careers, compared to reports of trafficking of players or success stories of football celebrities, we have rather focused on the boring aspects of African football migration. So why the fuss with the unspectacular? Why looking at the before and after of African football careers outside the spotlight of the global sport and the media industry? Well, much of the existing literature dealing with African football migration has focused on actual careers of players. By this, it has rather drawn a blurred picture of either tremendous success of a few or the victimization of many others, and largely remained in the explanatory models of sport and its industry itself. And we argue that the focus on everyday aspiring and former players can shed light on an important yet widely neglected aspect in the wheel of African football migration, which is its localization in the various African settings. And here a key feature is football migration's link to social mobility. While migration through football reflects the norm of social mobility and high demands of achieving social status, for example by providing for one's family, it often comes along with experiences of social immobility and being stuck in one's life course that lead to precarious livelihoods and to social and economic uncertainty towards the future. However, how people deal with this challenge remains widely unknown. Thus, our paper is a call to situate football migration in the actual lives of players in their social environments in order to draw a more nuanced picture that acknowledges the problems connected to football immobility, yet goes beyond the mentioned dichotomy of victimization on the one hand and the images of excessive success of a few. What needs to be done in practice, though? For players approaching post-careers, the football industry, that's clubs, associations, but also player agents, need to implement measures that offer particularly vulnerable migrant players opportunities to provide for their well-being after their career. That may be job trainings or other educational opportunities. And that may be difficult to implement in a business oriented towards fast success and rather short-term goals. However, we argue that structures of the game need to be changed in order to provide space for long-lasting social mobility of former players. One may argue, though, that Ibrahim could have returned home to Ghana to avoid social mobility in Northern Europe. However, returning home almost empty-handed is not an option for African football migrants. Confronted with the shame of having failed to become somebody while in Europe, they will rather stay in Europe and struggle abroad. Concerning aspiring football migrants, on the other hand, while their passion for the game may be a necessary condition for their aspiration to migrate, more important motives are the lack of other possibilities and trajectories to achieve social mobility at home. And then, rather than a task for the football industry, this problem needs to be addressed by political agendas of the respective countries. And we argue that only if young men have a realistic chance to other channels, through education or other employment opportunities, then football migration would lose its appeal and the football industry cannot count on the cheap supply of the numerous young African talents who are not going to make it anyway. And it is in the light of this lack of possibilities that, for example, Daniels Lee continuously spends his money on dubious football castings like the one advertised. And asking him for the reason to do so, he replied, "You never know. There's no harm in trying." But as we know from Ibrahim's and other rather precarious trajectories, there may be challenging experiences waiting, leading to continuous states of social immobility during and after transnational careers. Nevertheless, if alternative options remain scarce, this is what Daniel and other young men in West Africa continue to do to keep the slight chance of social mobility alive. Thanks a lot.
Again, I want to try to just make some sort of big points here and then sort of turn it over to you. So the one thing that I'm going to sort of take the historical approach here. The one thing I was very interested in is labor flows, as to how the different people that you were talking about, how that fits into other sort of areas of transnational labor movement. I mean, how do football players sort of, I mean, if we think about sort of movement as a historical phenomena, I mean, it sort of changes over time. So Romeo was the one who put it in a more historical context, but how do your players, I mean, where is there a shift? When does it become incredibly popular to sort of seek out an international football career? I mean, is there a particular point in time, and what does that relate to? The second is sort of a historical point as well, and I wonder if this relates back to some of the fan issues. When does the imaginary world change? So when does football migration become popular in a cultural sense? So the culture of sort of migration, you know, where, I mean, what is it? Is it media? Is it the end of colonialism? I mean, what is it? Is it, you know, what are the historical forces at play that sort of create this desire to go play football in another place? And when does that begin? That's something, as Sven had mentioned in our last conference, we talked a little bit more about, but I would be interested as to when that was possible. And the third point is networks. So a lot of times these networks are somewhat invisible. I mean, I was interested, Romeo, in your story about Juan Sanchez. I mean, he kind of left Mexico. We went to the United States. He came back to Mexico. How was he in the story, he just kind of passes over the border, but how did that happen? I mean, how did that transpire? And I was also interested in his story in the sense that, so he feels he fails in the US as a football player, so he decides to go back to Mexico. But I mean, these individuals are migrants, do they sort of see other opportunities as well? sort of beyond football? I mean, does this sort of get them into another place and say, hey, I'm not going to be a professional football player, but there's something else I can do there? So how much of that is actually going on as well? And okay, so I think I'll start with that and maybe let you respond.
Whoever wants to.
Okay, then for the Ghanaian case, I'll start with the second question, then evolve from there. When did football become such a great thing in history? That was it, right? So football in West Africa was introduced in the second half of the 19th century by European settlers and mercenaries and other people who came to the shores of West Africa. And it became quickly popular because it was also a means for education of young men, in particular in schools. On the other hand, it was a means for the colonial administration to discipline the local population. Still, the local male population again used football also as a counter means to counter these strategic colonial efforts to discipline the local population. So football was, throughout the 20th century, an important asset, and particularly when it came to independence of the young states, then football was promoted to also promote ideas of national identities of the countries. And for a long time, since the mid-1990s, this was rather an inward orientation. And the outward, this was very visible in local derbies of great clubs. That was massive in Ghana, for example, when the two biggest clubs from Kumasi and Accra played against each other. And this has drastically changed. Not so many people are interested in local football anymore. They are all oriented towards European football, as we also heard in previous papers today. And with the success, as I said, of junior teams at World Cup levels, African teams, and also with the professionalization and the commercialization of European football, and also with the ease of the restriction of players that you could include in your squads, then football became a big means for Africans to go to Europe. That's in a nutshell. Then networks, yeah, the young guys, they frequently use networks, and they use personal networks like friends who have made it one way or the other to Asia, to Europe, and who could probably organize visa or trial trainings. On the other hand, Facebook is a very important means as a network for them, because they search for agents at Facebook and contact them, and agents would also offer their service for these young footballers through Facebook. So those are the most important networks, I'd say.
So part of the reason, or the effort to sort of tell this narrative, was because I know so little about the trajectory, right, and the sort of place of Mexican Americans in U.S. soccer. So I wanted to sort of write it out to see what kind of themes emerge. And some of the things that became apparent to me is that in the 50s, there are Mexican teams in the U.S., amateurs, but they're very little. There's one in Chicago, one in San Francisco, and they're playing in European leagues, right? Leagues formed by second, third generation, first generation Europeans. So it's not until the 60s and 70s that you really have the formation of Mexican adult leagues in the U.S. So there is this sort of way in which they're building on older historical migrations, and they're adapting soccer as part of this sort of migrant network that's taking place. I think what's particularly interesting about this time period, of course, is when they have children in the U.S., both the parents and the children, they're still looking to Mexican soccer as the sort of soccer, right? This is pre-MLS, so I think there is a sort of way in which people like Juan Sanchez, their dream of success, or their dream of soccer is very much situated in the South, right? And what's interesting about this time period, again, is its development in the U.S. makes it so that you have the migration of both professional and amateur players, and this movement's going back and forth.
Has that changed sort of more recently, where where soccer, football has become a bigger industry in the United States? Is now there more of an appeal to sort of go play for an MLS team, or?
I think there has, and I think part of that has been the academies and sort of disrupting a little bit of the exclusionary.
So you're seeing a similar phenomenon in the U.S. now that you see with in Europe, with the sort of migration from places like Africa.
Oh, you mean like Mexican players coming to the U.S. to play?
Yes, coming to the U.S. I mean, it's the same.
I feel like there's still
of a glorious future. Does that exist in U.S. soccer?
Are Mexican players?
Yeah. Do
they
feel that look at the U.S. as sort of a place that
I think they look at it as a big paycheck, right? I mean, I could be wrong about that, but I don't know that they're looking at
that as a place to. Yeah, I mean, the Mexican League is still probably better than the U.S. League. I mean, that's so interesting because again, you've got a country where the resources are, but yet the Mexican League probably has better clubs.
There was a really nice BBC like 10-minute documentary that followed a couple Mexican-American players that were playing in Mexico, and they talked about getting paid more in Mexico and also what that meant because Mexico's cheaper to live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, come.
Well, I'm not a historian. Maybe there is people here that would answer better than I will, but I'll try. The first Brazilian to win a World Cup was wearing an Italian shirt. And I will use this as an example of the first wave. These waves depends on national legislation. He went to Italy as a rimpatriati. After there was the oriundis, after there was the ban. And in every country, it's different. So in the 30s, it was easy. After, more difficult. But there was always some players that went out. In the 60s, I used the example of Pacotti, who played for a national team. I talked to him. In the 80s, we could think of Socrates, Zico, Falcão. But we have to know that it was a very different situation. Falcão once said that what they gain as a salary in 1 year, now a player gain in 15 days. And that was before Neymar and China. I think that now they gain in 1 day. So it's a completely different situation. I think it started to change in the 70s.
In the 70s.
After Brazil won the World Cup. Mm-hmm. Before the 70s,
yeah, because Pele never played, right, in Europe.
Excuse me?
Pele didn't play in Europe.
Oh, no. Santos was bigger than Europe.
Right.
And the football career was not a good profession. If we take the example of Ayrton Moreira and Zezé Moreira, who are very important players in Brazil on a couch, they got beaten by their father and mother because they were playing and not studying. Oh. And now, if you get the example of Neymar Sr., it takes him to start playing with 5 years old. So it's a big, huge change. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Who was you showed one player who played in Morocco, right?
Yeah, well, I studied many players.
So the player who played in Morocco, I mean, that's a very different type of migration, and obviously the finances of that and the opportunity there is something completely different.
He gets as a salary what would correspond to 2 minimum salaries in Brazil. But they send all this money to Brazil. And he lives with an apartment that the club gives to him, and with what he gets with victories. So it's a good situation for him.
It's a good system. Okay, the audience. Questions? Yes, there's a gentleman in the back.
Hi, thanks very much. I guess I have 2 questions. One is on Brazilian migration. To what extent have you explored women's Brazilian football players, women Brazilian football migrants? Because certainly there are many of them. And then, sort of for Christian, I'm wondering how different, or do you see a difference between West African migrants' experience and those of other regions? So, for example, we could take sort of Juan Sanchez, his life story, and say, does this map onto sort of the version of West African migrants as, you know, as unsuccessful soccer migrants? Thanks.
Okay, then I'll start. Well, if there are a difference between West African migrations compared to other regions, probably we can compare football migration from the global south to the global north as a means, I think, in general, to not only to play football abroad and to get exposure, but also to achieve social mobility. And as we all know, probably migration from the global south to the global north is almost for all difficult and increasingly difficult. So there are the connections. What may be specific in West African migration is that although migration for young people has been there for many years, but then it was mainly related to education or marriage migration, for example. That was a means to generate social mobility, and I'm not sure whether that took place in other regions as well. So football then came into the picture in the 1990s. Yeah, that's from my side.
I just wanted to add something. So I interviewed both Aurelio and Juan Sanchez for this paper. You know, they're nice oral histories, and they were a little bit different. But one of the things that Aurelio mentioned about Juan was that when he was in college, he goes to Mexico, and he, you know, he doesn't do as well as he would like, but a third division team offers him a contract. And he calls his dad back and he tells him, hey, I got a contract, I'm going to stay here. And the dad says, no, like, you should come back to college. And because once you go pro, you know, your collegiate career is over. Juan hangs up, he thinks about it, and 3 hours later he calls him back and he says, okay, you're right, I'm going to come back and finish my degree. And I think the reason that Juan has a successful career in soccer after is because he gets his college degree, right? So I think that might be one of the ways in which, like, a turning point, which I think reflects some of the conversations from yesterday about the ways in which these African academies are trying to sort of work in and against colonialism, right? And college perhaps provides some sort of safety net.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question about women. Sini Agengart has a very good book about the women migration. I have a chapter on the Brazilian situation. There was a ban. Women were forbidden to play soccer in Brazil until 1979. And it was the same in many European countries, Germany, France. Before that, before the end of the Second World War, where the situation changed for all women in all professions, we went backwards. There was more than 200 clubs, women clubs in Brazil. And there was, nationally, it was very strong. We have to say that comparing the two migration, that the motivation for a woman to go abroad is much more strong because it's the only way to play professionally until recently. Now it's changed. FIFA is requiring change. And there is another motivation. It's the way that queer women can express their homosexuality or their sexuality freely abroad. Brazil, it's a very conservative country. It's in these matters.
Folks, thank you for an outstanding panel, all three of you. This is a question which is probably for Carmen and Christian, maybe more of a thought. It's clear, Christian, you've just kind of explicitly discussed the global south, the global north kind of migratory pathway, and you both offered fascinating insights onto it. I'm wondering, particularly in thinking about Ibrahim and Daniel, the two figures that you were discussing, and thinking about the mundane aspects that are kind of informing the migratory aspirations, the hopes, the desires, I noted the absence of education, and I imagine it's the very same, or plays a major role in your work as well, Carmen. I wondered if you could both discuss, because you're both looking at context of kind of neoliberal crisis of youth, the context where the 1980s have kind of eviscerated the standard pathways into education, employment, and social mobility. I'm wondering, you know, did Ibrahim and Daniel discuss education, or the fact that it's conspicuous by its absence in your talk today reflect kind of the meaning of education in their lives today? And I wondered, I imagine it applies the same or similarly in Brazil.
Well, yes, education for those who migrate early, for instance, to France, who is a mandatory to have education in the academies. Correct me if I'm wrong, Christian. Well, they got education. But for those who stay in Brazil, and it's almost impossible, because in Brazil we have training sections in the morning and in the afternoon, and they have to go to school at night, so you can imagine. So it's very complicated. I don't think I understood the rest of your question, but...
I'm interested, do they value education? How do they discuss education? What does it mean in their lives?
Oh, no, it's very important. Education, and their sons and daughters got good education, abroad especially. The children, sometimes, they act as a mediator between the family and the society where they are. I went to go shopping with Ari's family, for instance, and it was the little boy, 5 years old, who talked in Netherlands and to negotiate the price, to pay the. I mean, they are not in the bubble. They are outside, and they are mediators. And it's very common in other situations. Children are mediators.
Okay, I think there is, thanks for the question, which is really important. I think there is a difference in what they say and what they do. If you ask them, well, why not trying education, get a decent job training or whatsoever, then they say, yeah, of course, I will do that. No matter what, I will do that. But they don't. Even if they have the chance, they don't. They put all they have on football. And that is not really a naive strategy, I'd say. It's rather, it's a reflection of what's going on in the country, specifically Ghana. You can get a senior secondary degree, and then that qualifies you to go to university or to have teachers training, college education or whatsoever. But these trajectories are very rare. If you don't have the means or the links to important people, you can't embark on these journeys, and they know that. And in Ghana or West Africa now, this phrase of education is the passport to modernity, as Richard would call that, that is over. You are either an entrepreneur in whatsoever, small businesses, or you are a footballer, or both.
Thank you. Lunch, right? Okay. Thank you so much.